Look at this car. Normal, right? But what if I tell you that it's silently emitting a very unknown substance for humans, but very known for Volkswagen? Why does it matter? Because they're making a lot of money from it. To be more exact, 33 billion throughout the entire time of this scandal. The price is paid because of it? A sick world, sick people, and hundreds of premature deaths in the entire Europe. Funny enough, at the time, the automotive world was obsessed with green. However, as you might imagine, money always talks louder. But the collapse was inevitable, so how can Volkswagen still be one of the biggest automotive companies in the world, even after a collapse that almost liquidated it? To understand why Volkswagen decided to commit corporate self-destruction, you have to understand the year 2007. At the time, as mentioned before, the automotive world was obsessed with green. Toyota had the Prius, Honda had the Insight, but Volkswagen, the giant of Wolfsburg, had a problem. They didn't have a hybrid, and they didn't want one. They wanted to double down on diesel, but there was a wall in their way: the United States. The EPA had just introduced Tier 2 Bin 5 emissions standards. These were the strictest rules on the planet for nitrogen oxide. To meet them, an engine needed a massive, expensive system called selective catalytic reduction, which used a tank of liquid urea to scrub the exhaust. But SCR was a nightmare for Volkswagen's engineers. It was expensive, it took up trunk space, and it meant the customer had to refill a AdBlue tank every few thousand miles. It broke the Das Auto promise of simplicity and power. Martin Winterkorn, the CEO, known as the micrometer for his obsessive attention to detail, gave a mandate: conquer the US market with a 2.0-liter diesel engine that was clean, powerful, and cheap. The engineers looked at the physics. The physics said no. The culture of Volkswagen said, do it anyway or find a new job. When you trap smart people in a room with an impossible goal and a culture of fear, they don't produce miracles. They produce lies. The fraud wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a masterpiece of software engineering. The engineers realized that an emissions test is a highly predictable event. The car is on a dynamometer, a treadmill for cars. The steering wheel never moves. The hood is open. The speed follows a very specific government-mandated pattern. So they wrote a defeat device. It was a piece of code hidden deep within the engine control unit. When the software detected the test profile, stationary rear wheels, no steering input, specific atmospheric pressure, it flipped a switch. The engine entered dyno mode. In this mode, the car ran its emissions equipment at 100% capacity. It was perfectly clean. It was a Boy Scout. But the moment the ECU detected road conditions, the steering wheel turning, the GPS moving, it flipped the switch back. The emissions controls were effectively turned off. Why? Because running those controls full-time killed the car's performance. It lowered the fuel economy and caused the engine components to wear out in half the time. By cheating, Volkswagen gave the customer a car that felt like a rocket and sipped fuel like a bird. On the showroom floor, it was the green car of the year. On the highway, it was a chemical plant on wheels, pumping out 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxide. Imagine a cigarette that only smells like tobacco when a doctor is in the room, but turns into a chimney the second he leaves. That was the Volkswagen Jetta, the Golf, and the Passat from 2009 to 2015. 11 million cars worldwide were equipped with this digital mask. The lie was held for 6 years. It might have held forever if it weren't for a nonprofit called the ICCT and a small lab at West Virginia University. In 2013, the ICCT wanted to show Europe that diesel could be clean. They decided to test US spec Volkswagens because they believed the EPA's standards were the gold standard. They hired West Virginia University to do the real-world testing, but they didn't use a lab. They used a PEMS, a portable emissions measurement system. After that, they strapped it to the back of a rented VW Jetta and a Passat and drove from San Diego to Seattle. The data that came back was terrifying. On the road, the Jetta didn't just exceed the limit, it obliterated it. It was 15 to 35 times over the legal threshold. The Passat was 5 to 20 times over. The researchers were confused. They thought the cars were broken. Because of it, they checked everything, the sensors, the fuel, and then they ran the tests again. The results were the same. When the car was actually driving, it was a poison machine. They published their report in May 2014. The EPA and the California Air Resources Board saw it and started asking questions. Volkswagen's response? A masterclass in gaslighting. For 18 months, VW executives told the EPA that the discrepancies were due to technical issues or various testing conditions. They even issued a voluntary recall in December 2014, claiming a software patch would fix the glitch. In reality, that patch was just an update to the defeat device to make it harder to detect. They were digging a grave, and they didn't stop until the EPA threatened to ban their entire 2016 fleet from the U.S. market. On September 3, 2015, in a meeting room in El Monte, California, the wall finally cracked. A Volkswagen executive admitted the truth. It was a defeat device. On September 18, 2015, the EPA issued a formal notice of violation. The news hit the wires like a nuclear bomb. In the first 48 hours, Volkswagen's market value dropped by $15 billion. By the end of the week, it was $30 billion. Martin Winterkorn, the man who demanded perfection, resigned on September 23rd. He claimed he had no personal knowledge of the fraud, but in the corporate world, the captain goes down with the ship. Or in this case, the captain takes a $32 million pension and runs. The scale of the fraud was unprecedented. We are talking about 482,000 cars in the U.S. that were affected, 11 million globally, and the nitrogen oxide excess was equivalent to the total emissions of all power plants in the U.K. In 2016, the Department of Justice hit back. They didn't just want fines, they wanted blood. Volkswagen agreed to a $14.7 billion settlement in the U.S. This was the largest consumer class action settlement in automotive history. Most of that money, $10 billion, was for a buyback program. Volkswagen had to offer to buy back every single 2.0-liter diesel car they had sold since 2009 at their full value before the scandal. This created one of the most surreal sights in industrial history, the car graveyards. In the Mojave Desert, in abandoned football stadiums in Michigan, in ports in Baltimore, thousands of perfectly maintained Volkswagens were parked in massive, silent grids. Millions of dollars worth of engineering sitting in the sun, waiting for the scrap heap or a fix that might never come. By 2017, the legal hammer fell even harder. A $2.8 billion criminal fine. 6 executives were indicted. Oliver Schmidt, the man who had lied to the EPA in person, was arrested in a Florida airport. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The total cost to Volkswagen by 2020? $33.3 billion. To put that in perspective, that is enough money to buy every single person in the city of New York 4 brand new cars. It is more than the annual GDP of countries like Iceland or Estonia. All of that wealth, incinerated because of a few kilobytes of code. Why did they do it? It's easy to say they were evil, but the truth is more boring and more dangerous. It was the culture of arrogance. At Volkswagen, engineers weren't allowed to fail. If you couldn't meet a target, you didn't ask for more time or more budget. You found a way. In the upper echelons of the company, there was a belief that they were smarter than the regulators. They viewed the EPA not as a guardian of public health, but as a technical obstacle to be bypassed. They chose the cheat code because it was the most efficient way to hit a KPI. They optimized for the test, not the truth. This is what happens when a company becomes so big that it thinks it can rewrite the laws of physics. They thought they could simulate a clean engine through software and that the atmosphere wouldn't notice. But the atmosphere doesn't read press releases. The nitrogen oxide they pumped into the air didn't just disappear. Medical studies linked the Dieselgate emissions to hundreds of premature deaths across Europe due to respiratory failure and heart disease. The cost wasn't just $33 billion. It was measured in human lungs. The final act of the Dieselgate scandal is the most cynical. After spending billions on fines, Volkswagen realized they couldn't sell diesel anymore. The brand was radioactive. So, they did what every modern corporation does when they get caught. They rebranded. Suddenly, the company that had spent a decade fighting emission standards became the world's biggest advocate for electric vehicles. They announced a massive $50 billion investment into the ID electric line. They used the scandal as a springboard to jump into the future. They are now positioning themselves as the good guys of the green revolution. But let's be clear, this wasn't a moral awakening. It was a survival tactic. They didn't go electric because they loved the planet. They went electric because they were legally and financially forbidden from lying about diesel ever again. It is the ultimate corporate pivot. They poisoned the air, paid the fine, and now they want to sell you the cure. But with all that, how could Volkswagen not collapse and be liquidated forever? Basically, Volkswagen didn't go broke because they were too big to fail and had a massive squad backing them up. Think of it like a popular kid in school getting caught in a huge lie. Even if everyone is mad, he's still the captain of the football team, and his parents own the school. First, the German government literally owns a piece of the company. If Volkswagen goes down, the German economy takes a massive hit and 600,000 people lose their jobs. On top of that, Volkswagen isn't just one brand. They own Porsche, Lamborghini, and Audi. So, while the Volkswagen name was getting trashed in the news, people were still lining up to buy Lambos and Porsches, which kept the cash flowing in. The second reason they survived is that the biggest market in the world, China, didn't really care. In China, nobody drives diesel cars anyway, so they just kept buying millions of Volkswagen gas cars as if nothing happened. With all that Chinese money coming in, Volkswagen could afford to pay the $33 billion in fines, like it was just a really expensive parking ticket. Finally, they pulled a classic rebrand move. They stopped talking about diesel and started acting like they were the world's biggest fans of electric cars. They basically used the scandal as an excuse to announce they were going green, turning their biggest crime into a massive marketing campaign for their new electric fleet. Unbelievable, right? Subscribe for more.